All right. Chapter 5, the second phase. The Christian communities had to face a major crisis with the destruction of Jerusalem as the spiritual home of their faith. They were widely scattered with pockets of believers in many parts of the Roman Empire, with larger organized bodies in the big cities like Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Ephesus, and Corinth, diverse in background and composition. There was a certain amount of communication between the centers, but nothing approaching an integrated universal church. Emotional reactions to the outcome of the Jewish war with Rome must have been very mixed. It would be held that spiritually Jerusalem had deserved the fate of Sodom and the plagues of Egypt, but its overthrow had stimulated the beast to make war with the saints to overcome them and kill them. Antagonism to Rome would be fostered, and for some time conviction would be intensified that Jesus would be speedily return and triumph over the adversary. Many would be bitter against the Jews as the authors of the Troubles, Greeks, were prone to anti-Semitism, and now it would find a lodging in the church. It would be urged that the Jews had suffered because of their guilt in crucifying Christ, and that they were now clearly rejected by God in favor of the believing Gentiles. Ears would be ready to listen to teachers who opposed all Jewish practices and called for complete freedom from the law, and even to some who would distinguish between the God of the Jews, the demiurge, and the true God revealed by the incarnate Jesus, the Savior. The kind of reactions we have indicated here are substantiated by Christian literature of the subapostolic age. The position of the Christians for some decades was a grave one. They were a persecuted minority without legal status in many places, only able to meet in private, mingled with hopes that the calamities portended the second advent. There were nagging doubts. The doctrine of Christ had come from the Jews. Had it been a lying fable, the victory of Rome seemed complete. Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him? Unless these days should be shortened, there would be no flesh saved. Many found themselves unable to heed the call to endure to the end. They fell away and made their peace with the ruler of this world. The situation in Asia at the beginning of the 2nd century was reported on to the Emperor Trajan by Pliny the Younger when governor of Bithynia. Some who had been denounced as Christians at first confessed themselves Christians and then denied it. True, they had been of that persuasion formerly, but had now quitted it. Some 3 years, other many years, and a few as much as 25 years ago. They all worshipped your statue and the images of the gods and cursed the name of Christ. On the other hand, there was an abundance of new converts, as is usually the consequence of an ideology being outlawed and prescribed, and Pliny goes on to say that this contagious superstition is not confined to the cities, but has spread through the villages and the countryside. Nevertheless, it seems still possible to check and cure it. Ultimately, persecution established and unified the church, but for a considerable time after the catastrophe of AD 70, there was a darkness and chaos, division, and controversy. We obtain an impression of conditions from the later New Testament documents and from the Epistle of Clement of Rome to the Corinthians. They have to do with grave internal problems, false teachers, antinomianism, faction of rivalry, loss of confidence in the second advent, persecution, and apostasy. The long discourse to the disciples put into the mouth of Jesus in the 4th gospel has to be read as a message of exhortation from the author to the Christian communities with which he was concerned. The followers of Jesus are told to be at peace with one another and to love one another. Jesus promises not to leave them orphans. He will send them the Spirit of truth to instruct them. They must remain firmly attached to Jesus or they will perish. They must expect persecution in the world, but he has overcome the world. He prays that they may be united and kept from evil. We have previously pointed out that nothing wrong was seen in inventing sayings and speeches for individuals in the interests of doctrine and propaganda. This is why we have to be so careful with the Gospels, products of the period between AD 75 and 115, to note their tendencies and interests and reflections of contemporary circumstances. The Gospels, nevertheless, for all their mythologizing and special pleading, must be regarded as among the more potent instruments for saving Christianity from disintegration. They were a tower of strength to their own and following generations of believers, wresting victory from what might well have been utter defeat. They were sorely needed at the time they appeared. They salvaged and coordinated enough from the past to inspire the present and assure the future. They held on to the historic Jesus as the rock on which Christian faith was founded, even if they fitted him into the framework of Gentile concepts, even if they used his name as the vehicle through which they could express what was vital for their contemporaries to be told on such high authority. And they kept alive as relevant and indispensable to the Christian hope of salvation that Jesus had appeared among the Jews as the Messiah. There can be no doubt that the authors of the Gospels did as much as they could to utilize and hand on what they could discover about the life and teaching of Jesus from the limited written sources. And conservatively, they preferred these to oral traditions as most likely to be authentic. Mark, in employing the discourses of Peter, is exceptional, but after him, Matthew and Luke make very little use of agrapha, unwritten sayings, of Jesus, which were current and which men like Papias were avid to collect, and of which we have one compendium in the recently discovered Gospel of Thomas. The fourth Gospel has an additional unique source in the memoirs of the beloved disciple, but even here the evidence is that these had been recorded before they came into the hands of the author of this Gospel. It is the literary sources of the Gospels with which, therefore, we must be chiefly concerned. We have already dealt with the testimony book and must now seek more light on the teaching document to which we have referred and on the other materials such as the nativity stories, and then deal briefly with the environment and aims of the Gospels. The character of the second major source employed by Matthew and Luke creates the presumption that, like the testimony book, it emanated from Nazarene circles. If this work, as it would appear, was unknown to the author of Mark, a Greek version of it must have come into circulation some time after the war, made from a Hebrew and Aramaic original, possibly preserved by the survivors of the Palestinian community, which would argue that the Nazarenes managed to reorganize themselves. That they did so is confirmed by the information available to us. Eusebius relates on the authority of Hegesippus in the 2nd century that those apostles and disciples that remained alive after the war, together with members of the family of Jesus, met and took counsel concerning who should be titular head of the Nazarene in succession to his brother James. They chose a first cousin of his, Simon, son of Cleopas. Cleophas had been a brother of Joseph, the father of Jesus. This Simon lived to a great age and was finally crucified by the Romans in the reign of Trajan. Also associated with the leadership were James and Socher, grandsons of Jesus' brother Jude. Thus there was set up in the East a government vested for the time being in relations of the Messiah, a kind of caliphate, and rather like the position of the Booth family in the Salvation Army after the death of its founder. These relations became known as heirs desposini, and we must regard it as due to them that the Nazarenes witnessed to the descent of Jesus from David, to his being the firstborn of Joseph and Mary, and to his having been designated as the Messiah at his baptism in the Jordan. It is quite untrue, as church historians sometimes still assert, that the Nazarenes passed speedily into oblivion. Eusebius records that the great number of Jews joined them at this time, and this is intrinsically probable because they could offer a sure hope to those overwhelmed with despair. Rabbinical sources also testify to the influence of Nazarene propaganda on the Jewish people. In Simon's death, the succession passed to a Jew called Justus, not one of the heirs, and he was followed in turn by 12 other Jews whose names have been preserved down to AD 132. All of these, says Eusebius, were Hebrews from the first and received the knowledge of Christ pure and unadulterated. The Nazarenes were in possession of a gospel written in Aramaic, of which fragments have been preserved and produce much other literature partly known to us. Their communities were still active as late as the 5th century in north and east of Palestine. To what extent the reorganized Nazarenes were able to communicate with Christians elsewhere, we cannot tell. Mystery surrounds the epistles of James, Peter, and Jude in the New Testament. Some of the Nazarene writings certainly became known to the Christian churches, and one of the earliest could have been the teaching document available to Matthew and Luke. Both these Gospels introduce genealogies of Jesus, and that these came from the Nazarenes is stated by Julius Africanus in his letter to Aristides. He, coming from Nazareth and Kokaba, Jewish villages, to other parts of the country. These same survivors of the family of Jesus also related how King Herod, to conceal his own ignoble ancestry, had caused the public registers at Jerusalem to be burnt. It would be quite in character for a Jewish Christian community to be responsible for issuing a book like Q, a Masseh, Jeshua, Works of Jesus, and in fact, long afterwards, a Jewish parody of the gospel story bore this very title. Sayings of the early rabbis were collected and published as in the Perk Aboth, and many of their parables were also preserved. So what was done by post-war Judaism could equally be done by the Nazarenes. Indeed, the Talmud alludes to saying of Jesus in connection with incidents relating to the late 1st and early 2nd century. The tone of Q is Judaic, and some of the characteristics may well be due to controversy between the Nazarene position and that of the rabbis. This became intensified in the 3rd and 4th century, as may be seen from the Talmud and from the Nazarene commentary on Isaiah quoted by Jerome. But it had already started between AD 80 and AD 90. The Nazarenes were particularly opposed to the oral Torah, which the rabbis claimed went back to Moses on Sinai. With the Nazarenes, too, as with the Gentile Christians, the name of Jesus was being employed in the interests of policy before the close of the 1st century. In all 4 Gospels, products of the second phase of Christian experience, we can see Jesus being magnified and becoming more symbolic, more representative of ecclesiastical concerns, whether Christian or Nazarene, in the several areas where they were produced. The miracle is that the real Jesus has managed to survive the treatment of him and persists in the Gospels despite all efforts to take advantage of his incapacity to correct misrepresentation of his followers. The miracle has happened because so much of what is reported in the Gospels depends on sources which antedate the development of Christian doctrine in the 2nd century. Near the end of the 2nd century, Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyons, delivered himself of cogent reasons why it was right and proper for the universal church to have 4 Gospels. Among them, he mentions the 4 winds and the 4 quarters of the earth. He was not entirely without justification, for the probabilities favor the view that the Gospels were produced in areas north, south, east, and west of the eastern Mediterranean. We cannot say definitely that this was We cannot say definitely that this was so, and scholars are not fully agreed, but with the evidence available, the hypothesis seems to work out quite well that Mark saw the light in Italy, Matthew in Egypt, Luke in Greece, and John in Asia Minor. There is no need to repeat here what has already been said about Mark, but we do require to mention briefly the tendencies of this gospel. When it was composed, it was unique in Christian literature, a presentation of Jesus for the first time through the medium of biography. This already assured it, while it held the field of an enthusiastic welcome. When it was written, there was a risk that before long Jesus would come to be regarded as a myth, whereas it was basic to Christianity that he was no heavenly being who only appeared to be a man. Mark's gospel was calculated to obviate the risk by setting down what tradition had preserved and memory could recall. His work saved the historicity of Jesus. It provided a coherent account of the experiences of Jesus related to but freed from the intricacies of the prophetic gnosis. But Mark's gospel also takes account of the Roman attitude towards the Christians. Its tendencies are apologetic. Brandon has shown convincingly that Mark does all he can to disassociate. Brandon has shown convincingly that Mark does all he can to disassociate Jesus from Jewish nationalism. He initiates the whitewashing of Pontius Pilate. He refrains from mentioning that the Apostle Simon was one of the militant zealots, deliberately leaving the Aramaic word quana untranslated. Conceivably, for a similar reason, he makes Jesus emphasize his superiority to David rather than his descendant from David. According to a tradition, the reigning emperor Vespasian had sought to exterminate the descendants of David to prevent another Jewish messianic uprising. Obviously, we have to note the way in which Mark's gospel is slanted when we make use of its information. We turn now to the gospel in Egypt. We learn nothing from the New Testament about the church at Alexandria. We're only told that the distinguished preacher Apollos came from that city, and in the epistle to the Hebrews there is evidence that the author knew the writings of the Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria. The city had a very large Jewish population, and with its proximity to Judah must have been one of the first objectives of the Nazarene evangelists. We have already seen in the letter of the Emperor Claudius to the Alexandrians an indication that the Messianist agents were busy in the city, and it was in the same reign, according to Eusebius, that Mark proclaimed the gospel there. When leaving Alexandria in the 8th year of Nero, A.D. 61 and 62, Mark appointed a certain Ananus as first bishop, who held office until his death in the 4th year of Domitian, A.D. 84 and 85. This Ananus was evidently a Jew, for his name represents the Hebrew Hananiah. He was succeeded by Avilius, i.e. Abel, another Jew. From ancient times, Egypt had been a place of refuge for Jews escaping from political troubles in Palestine. Here many had fled from the overthrow of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in the 6th century BC, an event which Jews in AD 70 recalled only too poignantly. We know from Josephus that refugees again poured into Egypt as a result of the parallel disaster, including some 600 of the zealots, and we would expect that a number of Nazarenes reached Alexandria to swell the community there. The circumstances, as Brandon has pointed out, were conducive to the production of Alexandria rather than in Antioch in Syria. As many scholars hold of the gospel like that of Matthew, and would explain the characteristics of this gospel, at once Judaic and universalistic. No other gospel conveys so much that the great national calamity had been a punishment for the guilt of what had been done to the Messiah. No other so combines the limitation of the mission of Jesus to his own people with the recognition that Gentiles have by faith been admitted to the heritage of Israel to replace the children of the kingdom who have been cast out. Elements in the nativity story peculiar to the Gospel of Matthew may be thought to be another pointer to its Alexandrian origin. The account of the birth of Jesus is, of course, built on the legends of the birth and infancy of the great figures of Israel, Abraham, and Moses, current among the Jews. But in the Gospel, they are brought into relation with the virgin birth legend typical of Greek heroes like Perseus and Alexander himself, most apt for the land of Isis and the infant Horus, and having some support in the allegorical biblical interpretations of the first century Hellenicized Jewish author Philo of Alexandria. A feature of Matthew's story is that the infant Messiah escapes death by the flight of his parents to Egypt, so it is possible that we have here a reflection of the flight of Nazarenes to Egypt at the time of the war with Rome. This flight also was in obedience to a vision. One tradition speaks of the warning being conveyed by an angel as in the gospel story. It seems improbable in the face of what Josephus tells us that the Nazarenes fled to Pella beyond Jordan, as report has it, though they were in this area much later. Pella may have replaced the original Pelusium, the Egyptian border town on the way from Palestine. In the Gospel, Herod, to destroy the Messiah, killed the babes of Bethlehem, David's city. So Vespasian, as we have mentioned, after the capture of Jerusalem, commanded all of the family of David to be sought, that no one might be left of the royal stock. Since the find of a substantial collection of Gnostic manuscripts in Egypt, notably the Gospel of Thomas with its sayings of Jesus, some of which were previously known from the fragmentary Oxyrhynchus papyri, the view has been strongly favored that part of this material derived from Jewish Christian sources and reached Egypt from Palestine. There are links with the Nazarene Gospel of the Hebrews, which came to be regarded by some as the Hebrew original of Matthew. It is worthy of consideration, therefore, that Matthew originated in Egypt. If Mark did evangelize this country, his gospel brought to Alexandria on one of the ships which sailed regularly with Rome would be assured of a special welcome and greatly assisted the Christians in Egypt to sort out their problems. The author of Matthew united the 5-book structure of the testimony gospel with the groundwork of Mark, and greatly impressed with the teaching document brilliantly assembled sayings of Jesus in the long discourse of the Sermon on the Mount. The result of his achievements was an amalgam of Eastern and Western elements, and association of the Jewish and Gentile interests, and formulation of something like a Christian orthodoxy. These features and the concern of the author with the status of the church and its internal discipline suggest that the gospel was composed near the close of the 1st century, possibly in its last decade. The author sometimes combines his sources so that we have two Gadarene demonics, and 2 blind men cured at Jericho, and he introduces legendary elements not only in the nativity story but in his account of the crucifixion. The community for which he wrote was still partially Jewish, but he himself was not a Jew, and his written sources were Greek. No Jew would have understood the Hebrew parallelism in Zechariah 9:9, so as to suppose that both an ass and a fowl were brought to Jesus for his entry into Jerusalem. Neither would a Jew have made the welcoming crowd cry, "Hosanna to the Son of David." I'll leave it there.